territory and clan and different tribes, different languages. And so what we see in chapter 10 is that things have been dispersed already. People have already been scattered throughout all across the world. But then when we start in chapter 11, it says that the whole earth had one language and the same words. So we need to kind of reconcile that. And how do we make sense of it when the previous chapter just talked about how all these people are scattered, there's different tribes and nations, but Genesis 11 talks about how there's one language. One way to think about it is that the writer of Genesis is not writing in chronological order. That the events that had happened in Babel was a consequence of what God would do to spread and to scatter all peoples. So that, in fact, then, chapter 11, the Tower of Babel story, is really then perhaps a reflection on why God had to scatter people and what we read about in chapter 10. So it's kind of this idea that he's not writing in this linear fashion, right? But in fact, that chapter 11 is a reflection, a theological reflection on why this occurred, on why God had to scatter, why God had to scatter and move people across is because of what had happened in the events in Babel. And so, in fact, one of the ways that the writer wants to get our attention is doing it this way. In fact, that the events are not sequential. They don't happen in the order that we expected. So we can think of it as the events had already happened in Genesis 10 we read about. But in fact, Genesis 11 is explaining, well, this is why God had to do it. This is why God had to scatter, why God had to disperse people, is because of what we just read in chapter 11. Another thing that we want to notice just on a broad scale in chapter 11 as well is that the Tower of Babel story is sandwiched between two genealogies, right? And so what we see in chapter 10 is a genealogy that kind of starts with after Noah and his sons, with Shem. And then we see another genealogy being read after the Tower of Babel story. And so one idea is this, is that from the line of Shem, which was one of Noah's sons, right, you have this man named Eber. And he has a son, Joktan. And then right there, it kind of has his sons, his kids, and then it goes into the Babel story, right? And then from the genealogy after the Babel story, we have the line of Shem again, right? He has a son named Aber again, but he has a son called Peleg. And after that, that genealogy continues into Abram. So what I'm really saying is this, is that here you have from one line, from Shem, one son, one lineage, then went into what comprised of Babel, and the people there, but then you also have another genealogy from Shem with another son that goes into the promised land. Okay, so you see how the Babel story is kind of sandwiched between this genealogy as well. Let's go a little bit deeper into the text. They had the same language, it says, and then it says that the people migrated from the east, and they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. One thing we want to think about when it comes to the Bible's descriptions of geographical locations is it's not just a geographical location, right? This idea of migrating or moving eastward, gathering eastward, is not just one direction moving east. But in fact, there's actually a very strong spiritual and theological component to that as well. Right? You remember that when Adam and Eve had sinned against God, and they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, it says that they were moving east of Eden. Adam and Eve moved east of Eden. Also think and consider that when Cain had killed his brother, had received God's judgment that he was going to wander the ends of the earth, he also moved east as well. And so it's not surprising then that even in this story, the Tower of Babel story, that the people moved eastward. And so what's the significance of that? Well, it's this idea that, like I said, it's not just a geographical location, but in fact, it's a move away from God. It's a move away from Eden. It's a move away from the future promised land. It's a move away from God's presence. And we see here that a collective humanity, has gone eastward to gather in this place in the land called Shinar. The land Shinar is significant too because that will become the nation of Babylon. Right? And so you can see the significance in the Tower of Babel, but also the nation of Babylon as well. And how that nation and that word Babylon symbolizes the idea that they're filled with pride and they're filled with the desire to not obey and follow God. Right? So this move eastward then shouldn't surprise us that it's a move away from God. Humanity is increasingly wanting to have its own freedom, its own independence, its desire to do its own thing, apart from God's presence and apart from God's will. It says this in verse 3. It says, "And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar." One thing that I do want to acknowledge as a positive thing in this Babel story is that the human propensity and inclination to build. As we know that we are created by a God who creates. And we're created in the image of God. And therefore, we should not be surprised that God has given human beings this inclination to build something, right? To create. And that is something we do want to celebrate too. And in fact, in this passage right here, in that verse, that humankind is very resourceful as well, right? It says that they made bricks and burned them thoroughly because they didn't have stone. So one idea is that by heating it up, it's actually making those bricks stronger. And then that they had bitumen for mortar, which is kind of like a gluing substance of gluing down these bricks and to make it really strong as well. So this idea that human beings are able to find resources and use it in a way where they can make it strong, right? And this tower can be a representation of something that shows human creativity, in fact, and a use of imagination, and just being clever with its use of resources. So we can celebrate and we can acknowledge that in this Babel story, but the question is, well, why didn't it last? And what was the problem with it? It's not necessarily then that what they desired to do, which was build, but it's why. It's why they wanted to build this tower. And we see that very clearly when they say, "Let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." There's three things that we want to notice right there. Is that first, that human beings think that in their own strength, in their own ability, in their own might, that they can build a tower that could reach the heavens. They think that in their strength, in their cleverness, in their smarts, that they could reach God. They could reach the heavens. When in fact, the gospel as we know it is the complete opposite of that. It's because human beings cannot reach God that God had to come down to us in the flesh. And he had to live that perfect life we should have lived and died the death that we should have died. Jesus Christ did all of that for us. You also see the pride in the statement of that they wanted to make a name for themselves. Right? That this desire to build this tower was so that they wanted to be remembered. Humanity, they wanted to be acknowledged. They wanted something to last so that when they passed, that their names would be acknowledged, that they would be remembered by the following generations as well. And so we see that there's just this pride of wanting to be acknowledged, wanting to be remembered. They don't want to be forgotten. And then the last part they say is, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. That's one part of the Babel story that perhaps isn't acknowledged or talked about so much. But one thing as I was reading this passage and just looking and just delving deeper into it is the reason behind all of this, the reason why they have gathered, I believe it's because of one word. It's because of fear. They don't want to be dispersed. They don't want to be scattered. And in fact, that's why they have gathered. It's because people have falsely gathered because of fear. That this idea that Babel is really a symbol of safety and of comfort and of protection and of what is familiar. And they fear that if they were to scatter and to go all these different parts of the world, that it's dangerous, right? Remember, we just came out of God's judgment from the flood, right? A humanity that was wiped out. The people here are probably aware of that story, right? And that there's this fear that if they scattered, they were to go fill the different ends of the earth, that something bad might happen to them as well. And so what we see first in this Babel story is we see a people who have falsely gathered. And the reasoning behind that is because it's driven out of fear. Fear makes us do a lot of different things, but one thing that it does is that it keeps us in the realm of what is safe. And it keeps us in the realm of what is comfortable, of what is secure, and of what we know that we can count on at the end. A couple weeks ago, Yuchin and I, we went to an event it was an interfaith event, and I'm actually taking a class on the practices of mission. And one of our assignments was to attend an interfaith event, meaning that attend an event that is basically with people of different faith traditions outside of Christianity. And so we went to an event that was basically hosting a dinner for Muslims, right? Because that month was Ramadan, right? Ramadan is the holiest month of the year for Muslims. They celebrate it for a month long because it's for them when the Quran was revealed, and that they see that as a holy event. And so it's this month-long thing, but what happens is they don't eat. They fast that whole month from the sunlit hours of the day. And so when they break the fast at night, that dinner is called an iftar. And so I had this opportunity to go with Yuchin to basically be around Muslims, right? And to just hear about what they celebrate, what their traditions are, and why they do it, and so forth. But one of the things that got me thinking about just that whole event was it had the opportunity for me to step outside of my comfort zone. Right? Was able to have a conversation with an older Muslim man. His name was Riznan. And it was only about 5 or 10 minutes, We didn't have a lot of time. They had to actually go back to the mosque and pray as well. So it wasn't a lot of time. And I wondered, how does one 5 to 10 minute conversation change anything, The whole point of this event was not to convert them. It's not to proselytize or share the gospel. It's just to dialogue and to have a conversation. But I had to really ask God to search my heart and to think that if this wasn't for a class, and if this wasn't for an assignment, is that something I would regularly do? Would I actively seek out an interfaith event, try to have a conversation with someone of a different faith tradition, and to have a dialogue with them? And that whole time, and I know I was talking to Yuchin about it, and there's just a lot of social anxiety, and it's awkward, but as I was reflecting on this story, I realized that a lot of times we operate out of fear. We operate in a way where something is comfortable and safe. And I have to ask, church, this question for us, but for all churches as well, is there a microcosm of Babel in the church today? Are our relationships, are the people that we surround ourselves with, are they people who are familiar? Are they people who are similar and just like us? Are they people who share the same values, the same beliefs, the same traditions? And is that all partly driven out of fear? And so I want us to consider that right now. I know that this is a largely Korean church, and we can't escape our ethnicity or anything like that. But this is not just an ethnic or an outsider thing or an external thing, but this is an inner heart posture. This is an attitude that I want us to consider, even outside the church in our own relationships with people. How often are we willing to step and confront our fears, because God has called us to live a life of faith, not fear. He has called us to trust Him, to venture into the places that are also unknown and unfamiliar, so that we can trust Him all the more and that our faith may deepen. And that's what we see here in this Babel story, is that people have gathered falsely because it's under the guise of fear. They're scared. They don't want to be scattered. They don't want to be scattered. Thankfully, God intervenes. And so here in verse 5 it says, "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built." One commentator will note that notice how God is active and part of his creation in that he takes notice, he sees what's happening, and he's actively involved in his creation. He says he came down to see the city and the tower and all the things that were happening. That God is a personal God, right? A God who is actively involved in creation, not some distant force that just looks from behind, from above and just oversees, but he's actively involved. He goes to see what's happening. And it says here in verse 6, "And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." So what does God do? Essentially, is people have, in this Bible story, people have one idea of what they want to do. Right? They have one language. They want to gather to make a name for themselves so that they won't be scattered. And so what does God do? He undoes all of that. He does the opposite. Right? He confuses their language. They cannot understand each other. They cannot understand each other. And then rather than people who had gathered, he scatters them all across. He scatters them all across to the different face of the earth. He confuses their language, and he scatters them all. And so I would say this is, yeah, people have falsely gathered in this story, one that's driven out of fear and not faith and trust in God. But also now God intervenes, and he rightfully scatters. Why does God do that? Why does God do that? Well, one thing we want to remind ourselves is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, God tells Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The people in this Bible story have not done that. They're refusing to do that. After the flood, God tells Noah in chapter 9, verse 1, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And fill the earth. So this is a creation mandate. This is a command from God. This is his desire for humanity is to go and to scatter, to fill the earth, to make much of his name. That is what God desires. So he rightfully scatters them because he's God. He's made this commandment. He's told humankind, to go and fill the earth. And so he scatters people all across to the different parts of the world. There's something interesting about this Babel story, and it's this idea of then, it's not only that God rightfully scatters people, but because of Jesus Christ and because of what he has done, God is also doing something else, is that I believe he's graciously regathering people as well. God is graciously regathering people as well. I want to read a passage from the book of Acts. And this is in Acts chapter 2. I just want you to listen and just to see what God is doing in light of what happened at Babel. It says, when the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as a fire appeared to them and rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now they were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together. And they were bewildered because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in his own native language? You know what's amazing about this story in Babel is, yes, in God's judgment, in what he rightfully could do, he scatters people all across. But here we see in this story in Acts and in Pentecost is the reversing of all of that. He scattered humanity because of their pride, because they wanted to make a name for himself. But now, God is bringing back together to create a family of God that includes not only Jews, Gentiles as well. Family of God. And so this just amazing picture that what we see here in Acts is a foretaste of what heaven's going to be like. How is Jesus Christ exalted and praised and glorified? Is if people in one language glorify him and praise him and worship him. But now, Christ is all the more exalted, all the more praised and worshiped because every tribe and every nation now is going to gather at the end, all speaking and worshiping God, and that somehow in the midst of all that, we're going to be able to understand it all too. Like, that's an amazing picture of what heaven is going to look like, brothers. Can you imagine all the different languages and peoples and cultures and all of these things all gathered under the family of God, that the people that God saves, and as we worship him, that he's going to be all the more praised, all the more glorified, because all of these different languages have come together, and it's all worshiping God. And that we'll all be able to join in and understand each other and just praise God all the more. It's a beautiful story about how God really, yes, there's judgment in the story. God has to scatter people because of their pride, because of their sin, but we also see the grace there as well. It's not just going to stay like that. God is gathering people. He's gathering his people, right? All different ethnicities, all different cultures. They've all gathered together, regathering people under his name to worship him for all of eternity. And so Pentecost is really a microcosm of what God is up to right now in this world. Different tribes, different nations coming together. I want to move forward now into this genealogy. I don't know if we can get to the next slide or not. Okay. So one thing that I wanted to share here in this passage is this genealogy, and it's going to coincide well with what Pastor Edmund's talking about with God calling Abram. But I thought it would be nice for us to visualize and see what this genealogy really is. What this genealogy really is. And how it basically starts with Shem, one of Noah's sons, and in his line, in his lineage, it leads all the way to God calling Abram. Now, this is interesting because there are 10 names in this genealogy, and there's striking similarities with a previous genealogy in Genesis chapter 5, before the flood and before Noah. And what we read in that is another list of 10 names. But interestingly, in Genesis chapter 5, it ends with this phrase, that this person lived for so many years, and then he died. Right? That it ends with that refrain, and he died, and so forth. But notice in this genealogy, it talks about not only how long the person lived, but how long after he fathered a son or a daughter. And it's just this idea of that one, in Genesis 5, is a genealogy about death, right? And obviously it's going to lead into God and Noah and the flood and all of those things. It's one of judgment. That death is inevitable because it is a result of our sin and our fallenness. But in this genealogy, I believe it's a different narrative. This is a genealogy that's celebrating life, right? One that continues from generation after generation. And so one thing that's amazing about this too is if you look that the lifespan of these people, it gets shorter and shorter. I don't know if you noticed that. The longevity of a person's life, it gets shorter and shorter. But one thing that we recognize, though, is in spite of the fact that the human lifespan gets shorter, that God is still preserving life. That God is a God of life. And that through generation to generation, he's still continuing and celebrating life. And ultimately, it's going to lead into God calling Abram, right, to be a blessing to all nations. Blessed to be a blessing. And then in just also this idea that from Abram, we have now the nation of Israel as well, and just this lineage that continues on and on and on after that. So it's amazing, too, that the focus here is not the fact that life gets shorter, but it's in the fact that God, in spite of the fact that it gets shorter, he's a God of life. He preserves it. And that this genealogy below is a lot different than the one we read about before the flood, before all of that, is that God is a God of life. So why don't we spend a few moments just reflecting on this passage and in this story. And I want to just ask first this question. We see in this story a people who have falsely gathered. We see in this story a people who have gathered not for the right reasons. And like I was trying to emphasize on, it was one that was driven out of fear. So, Church, Faith Harvest, I want to ask us, oftentimes, the people that are in our lives, the relationships that we have with others, is it one that is based more on fear? Is it one that is based just because it's comfortable and it's safe and it's secure and it's familiar? Where might God be asking us to live out and step out more in faith? So let's start with there and respond.